As the Ukrainian military continues its strikes on the Crimean Peninsula, Crimea is now effectively surrounded. Let's take a closer look at this situation today. The Ukrainian military is continuously attacking Crimea using drones. In fact, the Ukrainian forces are targeting all roads and sea routes leading to Crimea. First, let's look at what kind of attacks the Ukrainian military has carried out recently. According to a Reuters report, the fuel transport network in Crimea continues to be attacked. The Ukrainian military announced that they struck 8 Russian Shadow Fleet oil tankers with drones in the Azov Sea. These vessels were transporting fuel to the Crimean Peninsula, which is occupied by Russia. This route is an important passage connecting Crimea and the Russian-occupied southern regions of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military kept sending drones to this area and managed to disable 8 ships. What's interesting is that the Ukrainian military currently has very limited naval power. Nevertheless, with just drones and anti-ship missiles, they continue to challenge Russia's control of the sea, and now they're expanding their operations to directly target maritime supply lines. For Russia, it's becoming increasingly difficult for fuel tankers to safely reach the Crimean Peninsula. In fact, Ukraine didn't just stop at a single day. They've continued to attack ships in the same waters, putting pressure on the entire maritime supply route. If these attacks keep happening, Russia will have to assign more escort forces. They'll have no choice but to reroute their shipping paths or reduce the number of transport runs. As a result, it will take longer for fuel and military supplies to reach the front lines, and the burden on their logistics system will increase. In particular, the so-called Shadow Fleet plays a role in transporting Russian oil and fuel by circumventing international sanctions. Ukraine is clearly aiming to pressure not only Russia's military, but also its logistics system. Now, the targets of attack have expanded beyond just warships to include fuel tankers and supply ships, putting the entire maritime supply network heading to the Crimean Peninsula within range of Ukrainian drones. Recently, several unexplained explosions have occurred on oil tankers at Russian ports, sparking speculation that Ukraine may be responsible. Also, on July 8th, a Ukrainian drone unit was seen attacking 9 additional Russian oil tankers in the Azov Sea. From July 7th to July 8th, they attacked 21 Russian ships, and the drone units expressed their strong determination, saying that Moscow would soon fall. They continued to attack the Crimean Peninsula and are also repeatedly targeting energy facilities there, including 6 substations. From July 1st to July 8th alone, the Ukrainian military attacked as many as 50 energy facilities in Crimea, as well as the airbase and Jankoy port facilities and all fuel and ammunition facilities on the Crimean Peninsula. Because of these attacks, some areas of the Crimean Peninsula have been without electricity for days. As these attacks on the Crimean Peninsula continue, there have been fuel supply issues, food shortages, and power outages within Crimea. To solve this problem, Russia is disguising fuel transport vehicles as water tankers or milk delivery trucks and sending them to Crimea, yes. Even these are now detected by Ukrainian intelligence and attacked. The Ukrainian military now targets any trucks or similar vehicles seen moving supplies to Crimea, assuming they may be fuel transports.
Is that correct? Yes.
As a result, Crimea is effectively isolated. The Wall Street Journal assessed that as the main supply routes from mainland Russia to Crimea continue to be disrupted, Crimea is now in a situation of practical isolation. Russia has not yet completely lost the routes connected to Crimea, but it is now considered much more difficult to move troops and military supplies as reliably as before. Since all roads, railways, and sea routes are within Ukraine's surveillance and strike range, supplying the area has become much riskier. As this situation continues, the authorities in Crimea have declared a state of emergency, and it is reported that there are also disruptions in the supply of fuel and electricity in the region. Long power outages persist in some areas, and fuel shortages have led to prioritizing supply for government agencies and military facilities. Local residents are complaining about communication disruptions and inconveniences in daily life, and there are ongoing reports that unstable electricity and water supply are affecting their everyday lives. Russia is carrying out additional supply and restoration work, but as Ukraine repeatedly attacks supply bases and energy facilities, the speed of restoration cannot keep up with the speed of the attacks. For this reason, there are even assessments that Crimea is no longer a rear area far from the front lines, but is turning into another battlefield that is attacked daily. Crimea is extremely important to Russia. This is because Crimea itself is a key hub for Russian military logistics and for naval and air force operations on the southern front of the war in Ukraine. Much of the fuel, ammunition, and troops heading to the southern front travel through Crimea, where the Black Sea Fleet's main bases, military airfields, ammo depots, and maintenance sites are also located. The Russian military uses this area as a rear base to support the Kherson and Zaporizhia fronts, but ongoing drone and missile attacks on Crimea are likely to disrupt this support system. Repeated attacks on supply depots or fuel storage make it hard to store large amounts in one place, forcing dispersal to multiple locations and reducing transport efficiency. Russia is already showing signs of moving some supplies through alternate routes or changing transportation methods. This means that the burden on the existing supply system has increased that much, and managing air defenses is also becoming a significant concern. If air defense forces are concentrated to defend the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian mainland, the air defense capabilities of the units operating on the front lines will be weakened. On the other hand, if the front lines are prioritized for protection, military facilities, ports, airfields, and fuel facilities in the Crimean Peninsula and the mainland are more likely to be exposed to drone attacks. The problem is that air defenses are not something that can be expanded indefinitely. If one side is reinforced, the other side will inevitably have relative gaps, and Ukraine is taking advantage of this by continuing operations that put pressure on multiple areas simultaneously. For Russia, it remains increasingly difficult to choose which area to defend first. What's important here is that the Crimean Peninsula doesn't just have military significance. For President Putin, the Crimean Peninsula is also one of his most symbolic political achievements. Since annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia has promoted it as a historic achievement. President Putin views Crimea's incorporation as a key example of Russia's renewed power. After the annexation, Putin's approval ratings rose sharply. This shows its symbolic significance. Within Russia, the very fact that they regained the Crimean Peninsula was accepted as a source of national pride, and it became a region symbolizing Putin's strong leadership. But now, that symbolic region faces fuel shortages, power outages, and a declared state of emergency. Here, as Ukraine's drone and missile attacks continue, not only military facilities, but also major infrastructure continue to be threatened. This situation could show the Russian people that the Crimean Peninsula is no longer an absolutely safe rear base. If Russia keeps failing to fully stop attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, despite deploying many troops and equipment, questions may arise about the control and security President Putin has stressed. Since the Crimean Peninsula is not only a strategic stronghold that Russia must protect, but also a political symbol for Putin, the longer instability continues in this region, the greater the political as well as military burden could become. It's also necessary to look at the goals that Ukraine is aiming for. Currently, Ukraine does not seem to be planning a major amphibious operation to quickly retake Crimea. Instead, analysts say Ukraine is working to significantly raise the cost and burden for Russia to keep control of Crimea. This is why they continually target fuel storage, ammo depots, ports, railways, energy sites, and supply vehicles. Ukraine's strategy is to disrupt Russia's supply lines instead of capturing a single location, forcing Russia to use more troops and equipment for defense. If this occurs, Russia will need to use more resources to maintain its current forces instead of preparing a new offensive.
They're deploying more air defense systems.
As the process of repairing damaged facilities and securing new supply routes is repeated, the cost of war continues to increase. If this burden on Russia accumulates over a long period, it is expected that Russia's ability to wage war will gradually weaken. In particular, since the Crimean Peninsula is a strategic stronghold that Russia must maintain, it cannot be easily abandoned. However, if the situation continues where it is difficult to operate as stably as before, Russia will end up having to keep pouring in massive resources. Ukraine is reportedly targeting this point and maintaining pressure on the entire Crimean Peninsula. In other words, instead of taking the Crimean Peninsula all at once, the strategy is focused on gradually creating an environment that becomes increasingly difficult for Russia to handle on its own over time, thereby slowly gaining the initiative in the war.